Hey there, it's me, Phil Vischer. Welcome back to the show. I'm trying to talk. I clapped already. I'm trying to talk. I'm here with Sky Jatani.
Hi.
Hi, Sky. What color are you wearing today, Sky?
Black.
Oh, what do you know? And Christian Taylor.
Hey, Phil.
Hi, Christian. What color are you wearing today, Christian?
Spring green.
That's nice.
Yeah, because, even though it's 4 inches of snow outside, I decided I was going to stick to my guns and bring the spring.
Yeah, I know. We woke up this morning to snow.
Yeah.
And I put my snowblower away.
And my cars were outside.
That's no fun.
Cars were outside. And your children were outside overnight, too.
That's normal.
Poor little creatures. Somebody requested that I sing the song as Christopher Walken.
Oh, nice.
Can you do that?
I would probably have to practice that and try to develop a Christopher Walken impersonation.
You mean you didn't practice it?
No, I've been busy.
Yeah, right.
I didn't even try. I need to listen to him more. I haven't listened to him very much. My ukulele is a little bit out of tune, but we're in a hurry, so we don't have time to do anything. But this is I don't know if you all realize this, but this is a zero budget show. We don't have any revenue, and we don't get paid anything. So when you say, why don't you do more research into your stories? Who can afford to do more research?
You get what you pay for, people.
You get what you pay for. Okay, hey, it's a podcast. What do you know? Christopher Walken. Think about Christopher Walken. Hey, it's a podcast. And we got video. Hey, it's a podcast. So lend an ear. The Phil Vischer podcast starts right here. We'll talk Sky.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Sky. And Christian, too.
Hey, Phil. Oh, that sounded interesting.
Like Christopher Walken?
I don't know.
How would he sound?
I don't know. I need to
He's a
go watch
goofy
a
accent.
bunch of him. More cowbell.
Right.
Close.
We need more cowbell.
He's got that New York thing.
It's more his rate of speech.
Very unusual.
Choppy.
I spit. And we got no guest, not even Christopher Walken here for you.
But we have a guest chair.
We have a guest chair. Oh, yeah. There's a tiny chair in front of Sky. Hey, it's a podcast. It's lend an ear. The Phil Vischer podcast starts right here. The Phil Vischer podcast starts right here. So.
Yeah.
He seems kind of blasé.
Yeah, you having
What's wrong with
are you having a
that?
bad week? What's wrong with blasé? Well, it's like what's wrong with depression? What's wrong with depression? I'm really enjoying it. Come on, Sky.
There's like 4 inches of snow outside.
What's on your mind?
Nothing. I'm just,
How's your heart?
I'm doing all right.
He's just a little mellow today, I
You
guess.
stopped shaving again?
It's been a couple
That's
days.
usually a bad sign.
I did a men's retreat this weekend.
Are you eating?
Oh, yeah.
Are you sleeping?
Yeah.
Okay. You did a men's retreat this weekend. Where?
North side of Chicago, north suburbs.
Okay. At a church, not like at a camp?
No. It was the First Presbyterian Church of Evanston.
Ding!
Ding.
How many men?
40, 50.
How many women?
Phil.
How much longer are you going to be able to do gender-specific retreats before somebody says it's now like against the law?
Let's put it out there to our listeners. What do you think?
Well, let me ask you, have you ever done a women's retreat?
No, I have not.
Right,
In fact, I rarely do men's retreats.
Yeah,
because
right.
I'm not like a men's retreat kind
you're
of
not
guy.
that
What
kind
did you
of a
talk about?
guy.
Stuff.
Come on.
Guy stuff.
You
It's
can't
top
share
secret.
that with you.
It's top secret. The
You're not part of the club.
the things that guys talk about when no women are around. That's a whole different world.
Actually, I live in a man's world, and it is not as secretive or as
You're talking
special.
about your house, right?
Yeah, me and 5 men.
That wasn't a social statement about America or the western suburbs of Chicago.
No, my house.
Your house.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Okay.
So, what'd you talk about?
My normal shtick.
Which is?
The with stuff. I did 4 talks on redefining. One on redefining religion, one on redefining prayer, one on redefining purpose, and one on redefining radical.
That sounds good.
Redefining radical?
Yeah.
Oh, is that based on the go climb all the mountains and live crazy and adopt 100 children to show how radical you are for God?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a mild.
And your message was chill.
My message was the origin of the word radical is from the Latin word radicalis.
Yeah.
Which means rooted. So the truly radical Christian life is the one that's deeply rooted in communion with Christ, not the one that exhibits quote-unquote radical circumstances.
So what did it mean in its original context?
What?
To be radical.
Well, it's just become, because of the book Radical by David Platt, it's become really a popular,
I know. But I mean, go back to, how did it go from rooted to rad?
To rad. That's a good question. I don't know.
Root?
He isn't a linguist.
Why
He
are
is
you-
a
I'm not an
historian.
etymologist.
I thought
man.
maybe you did this research because you had to do a men's retreat and you had to explain it in your talk.
No, I've done this talk in a lot of places. I did it when we were at Biola together. The one about the prodigal
Did you not
son
listen?
story. He wasn't
I was
listening.
there. I was there. I was
He was,
listening.
he was
I
at
was
Main
listening.
Street Disneyland with
I
his
was listening.
computer.
No, I was sitting. I was sitting. I was your biggest fan that day.
Right.
I was your biggest fan.
From Disney World.
I was the first one at your book signing. Would you sign my book, Sky Jitani? We don't have a lot of new news, but we had a lot of response to last week's show.
It got a
Didn't we?
It's got a lot of
We had a lot of feedback,
interest.
and it was fun because it wasn't middle of the road.
It was
You
one
wouldn't
or the
say
other.
Yes.
In fact, I was hated and then loved.
In the same breath.
In the
I don't
same
think you
you
were
weren't hated. You weren't hated.
Right. My extreme radical Republican
upbringing. That's what we'll call it.
That's a great.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get
so
to that because we're
was-
going to read. I want to actually go over some of this feedback because some people send in some really interesting stuff that led to further reading, which I tried to do, even though I don't get paid to do this.
Wait, before you do that, though, that's
Yeah.
the reason for this little chair.
Why is the little chair there?
If those of you who are listening can't see, there's a little bitty chair in front of me.
It's very cute. It's
Yeah.
white with a little black
A
cushion.
miniature modern
So I was
chair.
thinking, like the Seattle Seahawks have their 12th man, right?
12th man,
and
yeah.
then like every small group has to have the empty chair for the newcomer,
Right.
and at Passover you have the Elijah thing. This
What is the Elijah thing? I don't know. What
you
you're
leave
talking
a spot for Elijah.
Oh,
Yeah, don't you do that at Passover?
I've not done
Come on
that
now.
before.
So this chair is for our listeners, because they're the fourth person on the podcast.
Oh, I love that.
Because
beautiful.
we get their feet. It's a dialogue, you see, between us
beautiful.
and the audience.
And heartwarming.
And I love them. I'm going to put it right here.
Christian just stole Sky's mini chair.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. JT Adamson wrote in and said, "Great podcast. Y'all are insightful." Now, I believe JT is from Canada. So
Y'all.
I think but he's like a
He's
farmer.
he's a farmer guy. He's the one
Yeah.
that shovels the horse manure and
While
listens to our
listening to the
podcast.
Yeah, thanks,
Which is
JT.
a metaphor for what we do.
He says, "Y'all are funny. However, my cell phone inadvertently made it a little bit funnier this week. The video explains." And then he posted this video on YouTube, and I'm going to play it. You can watch the video if you're watching the video, and if you're listening to the audio, you'll hear the audio, which pretty much covers it anyway. Anyway, this is what he put together.
Here's something weird that really happened. I listen to the Phil Vischer podcast every week in the car or when I'm shoveling horse poop. What's the Phil Vischer podcast? It's a witty, fun 45 minutes or so around the table covering pop culture, media, theology, and how to be a thoughtful Christian and play the ukulele.
Hey, it's a podcast. What do you know? Hey, it's a podcast. And we got video. Hey, it's a podcast. So lend an ear. The Phil Vischer podcast starts right here.
Most of the time, it's fashionista and actress Christian Taylor, author, speaker, pastor, and guy with a hippie name but not a hippie haircut, Sky Jitani, and of course, Phil Vischer, creator of VeggieTales and the voice of Bob the Tomato, Paul Grape, Mr. Lunt, Jimmy Gord, Mr. Nezer, may he rest in peace, and my favorite, Archibald Asparagus, and about a million other voices. So, this week, I'm listening on my drive home from work. Given the topic, I sense that Phil is heading toward mentioning something that happened to Joshua in the Old Testament, and I think, here comes one of my favorite Archibald Asparagus lines. This might happen.
Are you on our side or are you on their side? And you expect him to say,
I come with directions from the Lord. Great.
But no, stranger things were in store. You see, if I get a phone call, it interrupts the podcast. If my daughter calls, it rings a veggie ringtone. So this actually happened.
in the story of Joshua, when the angel of the Lord, the head of the Lord's army, appears to him, and Joshua says,
Oh, where is my cell phone? Oh, where is my cell phone? Oh, where, 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 oh, where is my cell phone?
While we're on the subject, you need to start listening to the Phil Vischer podcast. Find it on iTunes or at philvischer.com.
That was really well done.
So
That was-
incredibly creative.
Hey, J.T. Adamson can do more than shovel poop.
He sure
yes,
can.
you can.
So, J.T., thank you very
Thank
much.
you,
And you know, you mentioned earlier that we have no budget and we have no revenue and we
Yeah.
have no marketing. So if there are other podcast fans out there who have that kind of capacity to create those kinds of videos and want to market this for us, we would welcome it.
Yeah, we totally stand behind you.
I see where you're going with this.
It's called crowdsourcing.
Crowdsourcing. We're
Right.
going to crowdsource our marketing campaigns.
The little chair.
The little chair is the crowd
There is a reason for this chair.
because we have a tiny crowd.
No, because there is a new thing happening.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, I know what I'm talking about.
You know, I finished What's in the Bible about a year ago now.
It's been a year.
Yeah, it's been about a year.
Yeah, it was Easter.
Yeah.
So you've been.
So what have I been doing
Yeah,
since
what
then?
have you been doing?
I don't know. What have I been doing
Well,
since then?
something with little tiny chairs, I think.
I think he's
Maybe.
been producing a completely non-revenue producing podcast.
There's that, and doing some speaking. But no, we're making something new with the puppets. We're taking the puppets into a different world.
Oh, a different world.
Something narrative, not just talking head puppets, but actual story. I realized because I spent 5 years working on What's in the Bible, I hadn't told a story in 5 years.
Bible's a story.
Kind of. Well, I mean,
were commenting on the
I
story.
retold Esther in 2 minutes. That's not really, doesn't really scratch the itch of the story.
So you're taking the puppets where no puppet has boldly gone before.
That's as much as we'll say.
Yeah.
We'll give you more updates. Something, but ideally it will be out in stores this fall. October.
In time for
I think
Christmas.
We're aiming at. In time for Christmas, a new adventure with puppets. Okay. But that's not all the feedback we got.
Okay.
That was one thing.
It was very nice.
Yeah, and then we got, Andre says, is there a foreseeable, and this is talking about the topic of the over-identification of America and Christianity or patriotism and Christianity, and, do you have to believe this? Is America all about...
Is it Andre or Andrea? What is it? I thought it was a girl.
Well, it's Andre and Selena.
Oh,
so maybe
it's a
it's
joint
both
account.
of them in a joint account, and I don't know which one is writing to us. Is there a foreseeable end to this linking of American patriotism with Christianity? I hope so, because in my uneducated view, we are all proud of our uneducated
Especially
views.
me.
Think we will alienate a whole generation of younger American minorities that may have a desire for God but are in disagreement with American quote-unquote Republican ideas. Even I, as a mom, it must be Selena, not Andre. Do you think it's Andre the Giant? Is
Maybe
she
it's
married
just
to Andre
Selena on the
Giant?
weekend.
He's not living anymore.
What doesn't?
He died?
Yes.
Andre the Giant?
Yeah.
He died years
Sadly.
ago.
Did he fall off his
He was
beanstalk?
too big. He was like the brontosaurus. He was too big to survive the Ice
His
Age.
little heart couldn't handle it.
Even I, as a mom, have to fight to teach my kids that what they see around them and what they learn about in history in this country that is labeled as Christian is a very poor representation.
There was actually a study done, and if I had come prepared, I could have brought it for you. It was by Campbell and
Zoop?
No, Campbell and Putnam and Campbell. There it is.
Interesting.
And there was a summary of it in the Atlantic years ago showing they did all kinds of research about millennials and leaving the faith and leaving the church and all these other studies. And what they concluded was that as the religious right has gained more and more and more momentum over the last 30 years, that is the single largest contributor to people abandoning their faith. The young people, because if you're under the age of 30, you've never known a form of Christianity in the United States that was not associated with
Was not
conservative,
politicized.
was not politicized by conservative Republican politics. And when you're 20, 25, and usually the younger people are the more liberal they are in their views, and they tend to go more conservative as they get older. But they think that it's a package deal, that in order to be Christian, you also have to be a conservative Republican, and they don't want that. And so they reject the whole kit and caboodle. So there's objective research to show this is a significant factor in driving young people away.
Yeah. Okay. Then my friend Cedric says, hi, Cedric. My friend Cedric wrote in and said, very thought-provoking discussion. Maybe I misunderstood, but it sounded to me like you were implying that America was a thoroughly secular country until the 1950s when suddenly our media and government leaders got religion for purely political reasons. That seems like a cynical misrepresentation of the truth to me. Didn't we have the Bible taught in public schools from the 1700s all the way until the 1960s and prayer in school? Yes, I agree that it's not accurate to portray American history as an idealized biblical utopia, but I think it's equally inaccurate to suggest that American history was thoroughly secular until the 1950s.
Yeah, it wasn't thoroughly secular.
I don't think we said that. I don't think what we were the story was a piece written by someone else that we were reporting on that was suggesting that the one nation under God and the heavy association with Christianity and America had a re-emphasis. It may have been a re-emphasis or an overemphasis in the 1950s as a reaction to communism. Right?
Yeah, and another nuance to this whole thing is it was really the mid-20th century that saw explicitly Christian ideas coming into the federal government. Back in 1776, there were state governments that were heavily influenced by Christian thought, but the federal government was set up as a secular entity. And yes, you can go back and read things like Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he references God and even has biblical allusions and things like that, because Christianity was an understood point of reference for the whole culture, but that was
Right.
true in Western Europe as well. It's not just the United States, but it really wasn't. It wasn't understood that the United States was a quote unquote Christian nation from a federal point of view until the 20th century.
Well, we have some people that disagree with what you just
I know they do.
just said. Okay, this is in from Nathan. Good morning. I'm a member of Game Church. Game Church.
Oh, yeah.
That's the magic people.
Right.
That had the question about magic last week. And listened to your podcast the other day about magic in games. Thank you for hitting the nail on the head and getting to the heart of the matter.
Wow.
Well done, Phil
We
Vischer
hit
podcast.
the nail on the head and got to the heart of the matter. But don't you like
from
the
the head to
messages
the butt.
that are an opening paragraph
Heart.
of "you're doing a good job" and then a but, and then
Phil,
What?
you're ringing.
what?
How come your ringtone is not?
That's not
VeggieTales.
coming from.
It's coming from your computer. Or,
It's coming from that computer. Oh no!
because your phone and your computer are connected,
Things are weird.
and we're
Okay.
hearing it in the headphones.
Okay.
It's like magic.
That was crazy.
That was magical.
That was nuts.
All right, so back to
Okay, backing up.
yeah.
I'm a member of Game Church and I listen to your podcast. Thank you for hitting the nail on the head and getting to the heart of the matter. But my message to you today is not about the magic and its supernatural existence, but instead on the remaining podcast that you suggested that America has only recently held on to God. Now, I'm not sure we suggested
We did not say that.
and I
We did
think
not
that
say that.
might be a slight overstatement of the position. I'm sure you've probably gotten a lot of mail about it already. True. Refuting the fact that only since 1950s has there been prayer. I don't think we ever said
We never
that
said a
there's
thing
only
about
been
that.
prayer since the 1950s.
What we did talk about was the federal government using prayer at the beginning of cabinet meetings
yes,
and
like when
things
some
like
of those
that.
traditions started.
Sessions of Congress.
And
Exactly.
in God we trust on our money. And then he point me to an article at the United States Mint. This is at the U.S. Mint about In God We Trust. From Treasury Department records, this is the U.S. Mint talking, it appears that the first suggestion that God be recognized on U.S. coinage, I love the word coinage.
That's a great word.
Is that a nice word?
Is that like
coinage?
I coinage something?
Coinage. What's it? What, if you have a dollar bill, is that billage?
Could be.
Billage? No, isn't that what bilge?
Bilge. That's what
Yeah,
you get out
you
of a bottom of a boat.
That's different. Can be traced to a letter addressed to the Secretary of Treasury from a minister in 1861. That was a request that God be recognized on coinage.
But
An act of Congress approved on April 11th, 1864 authorized the coinage of 2-cent coins upon which the motto first appeared. So In God We Trust first appeared on 2-cent coins in 1864.
almost 100 years after the founding of the country, by the way.
The motto, and 100 years before, we just said it
Right,
happened. The motto was omitted from the new gold coins issued in 1907, causing a storm of public criticism. And I think I know some of those people. As a result, legislation passed in May 1908 made In God We Trust mandatory on all coins on which it had previously appeared. So 1908, In God We Trust was mandatory on coins, not all coins,
Right.
all coins which it had ever appeared
Which were the
on.
2-cent coins.
The 2-cent coins and the gold
gold coin.
coins, apparently. Several years ago, the appearance of In God We Trust on our money was challenged in the federal courts. The challenge was rejected by the lower federal courts, and the Supreme Court of the United States declined to review the case.
But now it's on all forms of currency, isn't
I
it?
believe it is, yes. And so that would be since the 1950s.
1950s.
But it did appear on certain coins
Right.
as far back as 1864.
Well, I think there's no question that
Good to know.
America was a deeply spiritual place and a religiously conservative or Christian place, way before when we were talking about. But I do think the difference is the politicizing of religion for specific political gains. And that did not happen. It was much more privately held. And I do think people were trying to, like we see here, move it into the public square and into the federal government. But I just think in the 1950s, it became a tool.
Yes. I also got lots of emails with different quotes from different early American leaders, and a lot from Supreme Court justices talking about whether America was a Christian nation. And this is interesting. Justice David Brewer, who died in 1910, so he was probably, that's a lifetime thing, so he was probably on the bench until 1910 in the Supreme Court. He was appointed to the court by President Harrison.
Who graduated from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio.
Is that true?
Just want to point that out.
Is that true?
That is true.
Is there a building named
Yes,
after
there
him?
is.
Is there a statue of him?
I don't think so, but I had many classes in that building because that's where the political science
Are your
department
sports
was.
teams the Fighting Harrisons?
No, we were the Redskins, which became politically incorrect.
That didn't last too long.
I'd go for Fighting Harrisons.
They changed that when I was there. Now we're the Red Hawks.
Red Hawks.
Yes.
Okay, that's better.
Because they're named after the Miami Indian tribe.
It's not too late to be the Fighting Harrisons.
No, it's not.
You could suggest
You
that.
should submit that.
Justice David Brewer said, "We constantly speak of this republic as a Christian nation. In fact, as the leading Christian nation of the world." He then chronicled the types of descriptions applied to nations. We classify nations, because this really gets down to the core, like what is it? If we say it's a Christian nation, what do we mean?
Does it just mean the majority of the population is Christian?
What do we mean by that? Brewer said, "We classify nations in various ways, as, for instance, by their form of government. One is a kingdom, another an empire, and still another a republic. Also by race. Great Britain is an Anglo-Saxon nation. France, a Gallio. Gallio.
Yeah.
It's gigolo, I think is how you pronounce that.
It's like Gallic.
Gaelic.
Gaelic.
So is it Gallio?
Well, why would the French be Gaelic?
Because they are.
They are, really?
I thought they're Franco.
I thought they were Franco.
Francophiles.
Isn't that the origin of I don't know. Anyway.
Gallic?
Somebody will look that up for us, I'm sure.
The French are garlic. Germany, a Teutonic. Russia, a Slav. And still again by religion. One is a Mohammedan nation. Others are heathen. And still others are Christian nations. So,
This is so early 20th century, the
so
language.
all the world's nations, you can put them in three pots.
You can label them.
Mohammedan, Christian, heathen. Which is your nation?
Right.
This republic is classified among the Christian nations of the world. It was so formally declared by the Supreme Court of the United States in the case of Holy Trinity Church versus United States. That court, after mentioning various circumstances, added, "These and many other matters which might be noticed add a volume of unofficial declarations to the massive organic utterances that this is a Christian nation."
I'm lost in that middle part.
The Supreme Court
What?
said there are organic utterances that say this is a Christian nation.
What does
Organic
that mean?
utterances.
The plants are shouting out?
I usually have that after I've had Mexican.
So
I'm just saying.
again, there
I could have done without that.
Sorry.
massive organic
Utterances.
So that's an example of thought around the turn of the century, the 20th century.
But it's an observation of our culture that
Yes.
that the predominantly America has been a European, therefore Christian nation by
But I think what it does say is that if you go back 100 years and you would say to people, even in Washington, is this a Christian nation?
Yeah, of course they'd say yes.
They would have said yes, but they were thinking in different categorical concepts than we are now.
But there's a difference between that and saying we need to legislate Christian ideas, values, laws through the government, which is a violation of the First Amendment.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Helen Martin says, interesting podcast, intriguing article, mind blown. Oh, and it's pronounced Olathe, Kansas. Olathe. Sorry.
Yeah.
I said several other things, but I did not
Now we
pronounce
know.
it. Thomas Kennedy says, I found myself thinking about the oft-repeated line from the Narnia books of Aslan not being a tame lion.
Didn't I say that in the podcast?
Yeah, that's when we were talking about magic, right?
Yeah.
Right.
To add another piece of history, Francis Bellamy, the writer of the Pledge of Allegiance, was a socialist.
That's quite interesting.
Carrie wrote us and said, I learned about your podcast from a circle of irreverent pastors.
That's interesting.
I'd like to be a
Who
part
are
of that
they?
group.
Do they have a secret
What does
handshake?
that mean? What is
Do they make
irreverent?
They make their own T-shirts. Shouldn't they be irreverent reverends?
Yeah, they should be the irreverends.
I love the playfulness and the deep forays into theology and culture. My wife and I listen to all of them. Thanks for listening. On your latest podcast, I learned about the whole Randolph Hearst and American Christianity embracing capitalism. Very interesting. I'm working as a missionary in Spain. This is interesting. The self-described conservatives here always align themselves with the Catholic Church. Given the recent history of Spain, the state and the church have always stuck together. In fact, today is St. Joseph's Day here in Madrid, which is kind of like Father's Day, except the entire country gets a paid holiday. What I found very interesting and somewhat confusing here is that all of my Protestant friends and the clergy I have known always tend to lean toward the left politically because they have always been harassed by the power of the church here. One time, my wife and I were invited to attend an art gathering of believers and found out the Christian brother who hosted it also ran for the mayor of his little village on the communist ticket. Wow. Anyway, thanks for continuing to challenge my cozy little world viewed with humor. So in Spain, if you're a Protestant Christian, you're a political liberal and maybe a communist.
Well,
I'm so confused.
See, here's what's so
How's all
fascinating.
that happen?
One of the significant differences between, especially Western Europe and the United States, is for centuries and centuries, the church dominated Europe.
Right.
And so when abuse happened by the powerful,
Right.
it was done in the name of the church.
Right.
So when liberal governments came along, and I mean liberal not by liberal conservative, but liberal meaning
Not dictatorships.
not dictatorships, democracies, and things like that. When those governments came into play, they were seen as the antidote to the abuse of the power of the church.
Right.
So in Europe, they tend to, in general, be far more pro-government than they are pro-church. In the U.S., we had just the opposite experience. We saw government as being the problem, which is why we rebelled against England and government from overseas, and we wanted to create a small federal government as possible, and we embraced religion. We still have in this country far more than Europe. So one thing you'll hear from Europeans is they say, well, what differentiates the U.S. from Europe is in the U.S. you love God, you love guns, and you hate government. Whereas in Europe, we don't love God, we don't understand guns, and we embrace government. Because they're reacting to different problems. We were reacting against government, they were reacting against church. So it makes sense then that the
interesting way to boil it
conservatives
down.
would latch onto the church there, the Catholic Church, and the Protestants
It's also tricky
latch on the government.
because, and some of the things that people sent in about America being a Christian nation, you know, one of the, and I think it was another Supreme Court justice said, you know, what is a Christian nation? What does it mean to say America is a Christian nation? And he went into a list. Does it mean, you know, it's the established religion of the state? No, it is not. Does it mean to run for office you have to be a professing Christian? No, it does not. Does it mean to immigrate? Do you have to be a Christian? No, it does not. And his definition, finally, and this is also around the turn of the 20th century, was that it is a Christian nation because it was built on and shaped by Christian values.
Judeo-Christian values.
He didn't say that. People didn't start using that
Right.
word until they were hanging out with more of their Jewish friends.
Okay.
And then they said, we want you guys to feel like you're a part of this too, so we'll tack on a prefix. But what's interesting, though, is because if you're interacting with atheists today, and you would say that, you know, this country, everything good about this country is from its Christian heritage, they'll immediately go to, oh, like the Crusades and the witch hunts and, you know, everything
slavery.
bad that Christians have ever done. But the values, when you go back to the foundings of this country, it's very specifically taking the traditions of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, which was rejection of monarch, you know, rejection of despot, people thinking for themselves. You know, people thinking for themselves was not a Christian virtue until the Reformation.
And until the Enlightenment, even after that.
But Luther is the one who said everyone needs to read the Bible for themselves.
Which
You
a
should
lot of
read
people
the
think
Bible.
led to the Enlightenment, this empowering of the
Yeah,
people and
right.
education and individualism and all that.
Right. So even when we say, and this is hard when you're dealing with very strong critics of Christianity, to say all these wonderful values of justice and people being able to determine their own lives and liberty and freedom, these are all Christian values. It's pretty easy to point to the more oppressive sides of the church, particularly the French church and the Spanish church. The French church and the Spanish church were both brutal. The Spanish church gave us the Spanish Inquisition. The French church was what created the French Revolution, which created, just tons of violence. And because they were closely associated with the state, and they were closely associated with the monarchy, and they propped up the monarchy, and the monarchy propped up them. So they were brutal. Where you have, and we've talked about this story, which was a cover story in Christianity Today, in colonies of those countries where you have Protestant missionaries that didn't represent the state, you have healthier countries today.
Right.
Where you had missionaries that were state-sponsored, so from a monarchy that's like the Spanish, that sent out Spanish missionaries to South America, it didn't benefit those cultures.
Okay, stop, rewind. What are the countries then?
Big chunks of Africa.
Okay.
And parts of Asia in particular.
So there were Protestant?
Where you had non-state-sponsored Protestant missionaries.
Okay.
This was an Andy Crouch story.
Okay.
Well, he came and spoke about it. He didn't write it.
I know. Oh, he didn't write it, right?
No.
But he was here to talk
He was the
about
editor.
That must have been a podcast I didn't listen
Yeah,
to.
because Andy Crouch was here, and
I was not.
If you're not on it,
No, but
you don't
I've changed
care.
that. I've changed that.
So if a country like African country, you can have two African countries right next to each other that were both colonies of Western powers.
Right.
If one of them had non-state sponsored Protestant missionaries and the other one didn't, the one that did is doing much better today than the one that didn't.
Interesting.
And the reason is that non-state sponsored Protestant missionaries, first of all, educated people, because people needed to read the Bible in their own language.
Okay.
So they did translations, they started schools, and they started publishing houses to get materials into their own language. They also stood up against the oppressing powers. So if it was a British colony and the British were being nasty to the locals, the missionaries stood up against the state power on behalf of the locals, and you have much healthier. So those are the values that America was swimming in when it started.
Another way to say that is, you can't say America was saturated in Christian values. You can say early America was saturated in post-reformation, Northern European, post-Enlightenment values.
Boy, that's a
values.
mouthful.
It is, yeah, which is one stream of the church, but there's many other streams of Christianity that would have not produced the kinds of individual rights and ideas
and in fact didn't. If you
Right.
look at South America, which
Yeah.
was also a product technically of a Christian colonizer, and it didn't go as well. Even I was just watching the history of the West, Ken Burns' documentary on the West. And, and I've visited missions in California. They go, oh, missions. And you think, the nice
They're pretty,
Spanish
yeah.
guys, and they were so nice to the natives, and they tried to teach them about Jesus. And, and you actually get into the history, and they actually brutalized some of the natives, and they enslaved some of the natives, and they put them in forced labor, and, and tried to eliminate their cultures and eliminate their languages. I was like, well, that's not very nice at all. They were much more like colonizers than the kind of missionaries that I'm used to,
Right.
because they came from Spain, and
Right.
that was not a happy place for Christianity. Okay, so it's complex. Is that what we're getting at?
Well,
that
yeah,
it's complex,
and
Guy?
there was someone else. I don't know if we're going to read this about the Thomas Jefferson piece.
No, there were lots of quotes from Thomas
because part of that
Jefferson.
is even the founding generation, even though they were heavily influenced by post-Reformation, Northern European, post-Enlightenment ideas, doesn't mean that they had to still be Christians in order to be influenced by them. So
But they used a lot of Christian language.
They did.
And if you didn't study about what they really meant, or looked at their whole lives, or looked at their body of writing, you would just assume that,
Right.
for example, Thomas Jefferson was what we know today as a Christian.
and someone
in air quotes.
quoted on your
He
Facebook
was a
page.
deist.
Yeah, that Thomas Jefferson declared that he was a true disciple of Jesus Christ. And he actually said that. That's true. But he also completely denied the resurrection. He denied the divinity of Jesus. He denied his miracles. He denied the authority of the scriptures.
He even cut pages out of the ones he didn't agree with.
He literally cut pages out of the Bible that he didn't like. And Yet he liked Jesus' philosophical and moral teachings,
Right.
which is why he called himself a disciple of Jesus. So Thomas Jefferson was not an Orthodox Christian as we would understand it today. You can't deny that Jesus is the Son of God and
Right.
still be an Orthodox Christian.
And Ben Franklin tried to create his own humanist society
Right.
of
Right.
self-perfection, where if you were intelligent enough, you could morally perfect yourself. Now, you still needed churches and you still needed religion for the masses, for the people that
Right.
weren't,
That couldn't think for themselves.
yeah, that weren't as intelligent as he was.
So these are men who were deeply influenced by Western Northern European Christianity, but they didn't actually adhere to it. They just took the pieces of it that they liked.
Benjamin Franklin stopped attending his Presbyterian church after the pastor preached a sermon that finally convinced Franklin. Oh, no, your phone's ringing.
No, not ringing.
Yeah.
Nothing's happening back there.
A sermon that finally convinced Franklin that he was more concerned with creating good Presbyterians than creating good citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And he felt that the purpose of religion should be to create just more morally upstanding people so you could have a free society.
Right.
And that was a central tenet of the Founding Fathers, that you need, that religion, particularly Christianity, which is what their entire frame of reference was, created morally upstanding citizens who could then self-govern. And there was a connection between virtue and faith and self-governance and
Which
freedom.
is true. And
But they did
absolutely
not
true.
want to link the federal government to that religion.
No.
Right.
They didn't, and
They wanted the
mostly
citizens
because there
to
was
be-
no other way to form the country. Because
Right.
you had 13 different colonies that were different sects of Christianity, and in some cases were killing each other. Puritans were killing Quakers.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I
So
didn't
they
know
just
that part.
they didn't want to bring that argument into the federal
No.
government. Let's just put that aside.
Because
You
that's-
states and colonies can have your own religious ideas, but the federal government's going to be neutral.
Right, because they were just coming out of several hundred years of terrible inter-Christian violence in Europe and
Right.
reacting to that.
We don't
By
wanna
the
go back
way,
there.
25. Okay, top 25 events in human history that have killed the most people. Top 25 events that have killed the most people.
I bet one of them.
How many involve Christianity?
These include natural disasters?
No.
Okay.
No, man-made.
And these don't include any
so it's not
Justin
like
Bieber
diseases?
events.
No.
Okay.
No.
So ask me that again.
Top 25 man-made people killing other people events. How many involve Christianity?
One.
Because if you listen to
Two.
Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and those guys, you probably conclude, like all of them.
Two.
Because religion is
So
behind
what's the
everything.
answer?
Two.
2.
Is that right? Am I
Yeah.
right?
That's right.
Yeah.
What's
Is
your
that-
what's your source?
Okay, name them.
Inquisition and the Crusades?
Inquisition
No.
killed like
It was
7
the eradication of native peoples in the Americas.
No, they don't blame that on Christianity.
blame it on Christianity?
Because most of it was viruses.
But they were Christian viruses. they came from Europe.
I love how you can back. He tells me no, and I just sit there. He tells you no, and you're like, "Well, wait a second."
Oh yeah, I'll go around.
You can defend your no answer. where
The Crusades are in the 20s, like number 20 or number 21 on most deaths.
okay, I did get the Crusades
Yes,
right.
that was good.
Okay, so what were the two?
What's the other one?
I haven't said the other one yet.
know.
The other one is number 11, I believe, on the list.
So let's guess.
Number 11. So killed many more
I
people
know.
than the
I know.
Crusades.
World War II. I mean,
That was
like
not a Christian conflict.
no. Hitler believed. No, stop. I certainly can at
World
least
War
make
II
an argument.
is the number one
Killer.
Right.
killer of humans in
Right.
human history. But the number one involving Christianity in human history is not the Crusades.
Rwandan genocide?
30 Years War.
30 years.
The 30 Years War. The 30. Yeah, I know. I had to read about
The
it.
30 Years
The
War.
30 Years War in Europe and that was the thing that the Benjamin Franklins and the Thomas Jeffersons were reacting to. It was the 30 Years War.
Okay.
Because it went on. Do you know how long it went on?
30 years?
You got
Oh,
it.
I got it right.
Ding,
Yay.
ding, ding,
Didn't
ding,
come
ding.
up with a better name for
Do
it.
know more about this than you think. And it started out as a conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Germany over power. And then it turned into a larger Protestant Catholic. So it's post-Reformation, kind of in the space between the Reformation and the Enlightenment, leading up to the founding of America.
And it's number what? Where is it on the
11.
list? How many people were
Because
killed?
it ended up sucking in all of Europe. All of Europe. So it was basically a world war
In Europe.
a European-wide
between
war.
Catholics and
How
Protestants.
many people were killed?
That's
a lot to be number
It was in
11.
the millions.
Yeah.
It was in the millions.
And it was Protestants and Catholics
Right.
killing each other.
Yeah, but then it spun into kind of two empires. You know, I forget if it was the Habsburgs and somebody else or who it was at that point. It wasn't the Habsburgs, but it was two dynasties ended up in a much larger conflict.
Wow.
But I found it interesting that of the 25 biggest takers of human life, only two of them really, and none of them are, Hindu or Buddhist. Everything else is secular. Mm-hmm. So the notion that religion is the source of all evil, which Richard Dawkins has pushed on time and time again, is flat out wrong. Sky Jitani wrote, do you know Sky Jitani?
I've heard of him.
He's a friend of mine.
He's kind of a hipster, isn't he?
It's a hippie name.
He said, regarding my comment to Christian about church attendance today versus 1966, Exhibit A. And then he put on, and many of you have seen this and commented, he put on the graph that shows in 1776, who was doing these surveys in 1776? I'm very curious about
Gallop.
that.
That's how he got his name. He was on his horse galloping around surveying people. And
The survey is coming. The survey is coming.
That's right.
Yeah. 1776, we believe only 17% of Americans said, well, they weren't Americans yet, of British colonists who had just declared independence, said they were associated with a specific church congregation. Mm-hmm. And by 1850, it was 34%. By 1890, it was 45%. By 1950, it was 59%. And this freaks me out. By 2005, 69%. So they're saying it has grown since the 1950s.
it has.
How's that?
Well,
How is that possible?
how is that? Part of it is immigration and trends in immigration.
Yeah, okay.
So since the 1950s, what's been the single largest group of immigrants to the United States?
Hispanic.
The Dutch.
The Dutch.
Hispanic.
Yeah, Hispanic, and they're very
Catholic.
for the most part,
Yeah.
predominantly
And
Catholic.
so they come and they find a church. And they
well, they
associate.
come and if you survey them,
Or
and they
if
say
you-
we're Catholic.
Okay, so if you say I'm Catholic, they say you're
Yes.
associated with a specific congregation. That's
well,
the question. That's the question.
I know, but there's a religious identity is the issue.
Okay.
Do you have a?
The percentage of Americans who say they belong to a local congregation. Mm-hmm. I guess if you're Catholic, you're automatically
You're
in a
part of the
parish.
parish.
You're in a parish.
That's
There
right.
you go. You're in. Ta-da!
If I die, who's the priest? He's
See, now I had heard that around the Civil War, that the country was much less religious than it is now, and that's something that surprises people.
Well,
when
what
they
we
hear
forget
that.
is during the founding generation, of the 1776 generation, you had the First Great Awakening,
Yeah.
which was accompanied by George Whitefield and his preaching, who happened to be a friend of Benjamin Franklin, who never
Right.
agreed with his preaching.
Right, but Ben Franklin printed up promotional
That's right,
materials
because
for him at his print shop.
because it was good for the
It
population
was
to be
good
religious,
for the masses.
for the riffraff.
Yes.
And then in the early 1800s,
It's funny how we've gone from thinking, I don't like religion, but it's good for the riffraff,
Right.
to it's bad for the riffraff.
Yeah.
No one should have religion. That's weird.
It is weird. And then in the early 1800s, you had
Do you know why? The Creation Museum.
What?
Because most of the atheists that are profoundly anti-theist are just completely ticked off by people rejecting evolution.
Okay.
That is like
That's
the
when you
single,
boil it down,
The,
that's
the
where it comes
single
from.
biggest thing that ticks them
Well,
off.
in
is
general,
that
though, they think that religious adherents are anti-science.
Yeah.
In general.
And how many different things can you point to as supporting data?
Mm-hmm.
Well, some people don't like abortion. You can say, oh, science tells us. Well, science doesn't really tell us anything about abortion, so that's hard to make that argument. But then they might reject global warming. Okay, that kind of ticks me off. They reject evolution. That's the foundation of biology. It's the foundation of everything. Now they're really ticked off, and that's why we have anti-theists.
Okay.
All right, so then in the early 1800s, there was the Second Great Awakening, which was Charles Finney and that whole crew, which it was why you see on that graph the number of...
Did Benjamin Franklin print his stuff too?
He was dead by then.
So sum up. Can you, in one sentence, sum up what happened in the First Great Awakening?
Yeah,
and then
it's actually very interesting history because the First Great Awakening was really the Methodists. So Methodism takes hold in England, And George Whitefield was a Methodist preacher. And these were folks who were really preaching about a personal relationship with Jesus, and your heart needs to be warmed, and you need to repent of your sins. It was kind of breaking down that
very strong commitment to personal holiness.
That's right, strong personal holiness. So Whitefield comes over along with the Wesleys and everything. They come to the colonies of the early American Republic, and George Whitefield was really the first celebrity in America, and he traveled up and down and open-air evangelist, open-air preached, and people came to faith. It was really remarkable.
Do you know, Ben Franklin in his autobiography tells a story about Whitefield preaching. And it's funny because he's preaching a sermon, and it's in downtown Philadelphia, I believe, open air, huge crowd. And instead of listening to the sermon, Ben Franklin is trying to calculate how this man's voice projects so well. How many people could be hearing this at one time without any amplification?
I think he came down to like 10,000.
Yeah, he came up with this massive number. So he's not listening to the sermon. He's running math calculations in his head.
Yeah.
That's who Ben Franklin was.
So then the Second Great Awakening was rather different because Charles Finney came along, and he was a lawyer by background. And he, I don't know how jaded to present this, but he ended up creating a lot of the tactics that we are familiar with in modern day evangelism, and sort of concocting environments in order to get people to respond. So he created a thing called the anxious bench, where he'd put people right in the front and he would preach right to them, and all these kind of manipulative tactics to get. And he'd have plants in the congregation.
The Ray Kroc of Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, so he'd have people planted in the congregation to have these strong responses.
Is it kind of like fear preaching?
There was a lot of fire and brimstone fear preaching, but it was also it was the origins of actually the advertising industry. The tactics that they used in that Second Great Awakening were tested and designed to provoke a response. And he wrote a book about how to do it. Finney did.
Do you know, was it Finney? Because my mom talks about the birth of child evangelism.
It probably was around that time.
Finney? Because there was a crusading preacher, and I think it was Finney, who had a pastor just for children, to convert children. And this was, in America, the birth of child evangelism, and he developed a technique that he guaranteed would convert a child to Christ within 30 seconds.
Oh, my goodness.
And the technique was...
Spanking?
No, it's worse. He would take the child, blindfold them, have their hand hold a hammer and a nail.
Come on.
Pound in the nail and say, "You are pounding this into Jesus' hand," and force the child to pound the nail in. And the kids would burst into tears and accept Christ.
Yeah.
That is the birth of child evangelism in America.
That's horrible.
Yeah. So there was a lot of that. Imagine that on all different...
So this is the Second Great Awakening.
This is the Second Great Awakening.
And so out of that,
and that was in the early 1830s, 1840s, that kind of time period. But you also had the backdrop then of the emergence of the abolitionist movement in that time period. And an idea that Christianity is very clearly supposed to have a social implication to our country. And then you have the Civil War in the 1860s and things like that. So then it gets all haywire, because then in the late 1800s, you get evolution, you get all that stuff happening, and people, it goes on and on. So
Dan Brewster looked at your chart and said, "I bet that chart would be in reverse if the question was how many true practicing Christians there were back then compared to today as a percentage of the population." I don't know. I don't know.
I think
Dan.
that is interesting to speculate.
It's hard to say, Dan.
I would kind of agree with him.
I think that true practicing, well, you have to define what's a true practicing Christian, and make sure you're dealing with the same definition in different periods of time, because that's changed through the years. And it probably, you would see really big swells around the Great Awakenings, around various revivals. In wartime, it probably swells. So there's all sorts of things that would make it not just be linear.
But if you do look at the writings, and if you look at data that we could look at, it would look very different from individual believers than it does today.
Yeah, I think what you can clearly say is, did Christian ideas and language have a greater influence on the culture 200 years ago? Absolutely. No doubt about it. But that doesn't mean adherence to Christian doctrine was stronger 200 years ago, and certainly not church engagement. That was definitely lower. 200 years ago.
JP Jennings says, wonderful discussion. It was interesting hearing all of your views and getting a fantastic history lesson. One question. What's with Christians' disdain for the New Deal?
What's the deal?
What is the deal?
What's the problem with the New Deal, Christian?
Well, I will have to say that, as I have said in the past, I was born a card-carrying Republican, unfortunately.
Christian's father was in the Reagan administration.
Right, we all know that.
Okay.
Anyway, my point is that I did move away, and I have gone to school, and I have met a lot of different people.
What
and
are
I've
you
traveled
implying
over
about
the
other
world.
Republicans?
No. I'm just talking about myself. I'm
Learn to
talking
put
about
my
myself,
shoes on.
Talking about myself.
Okay.
And so
dear.
in all of that, I have
Don't make
had
it
to.
worse for me.
I have had to look at what I was raised to believe, or what I thought, or what information I took in.
Because we talked about this offline, and we suspected that you may have been thinking more of Johnson's, utopian welfare state,
Yes.
as
The
opposed
Great Society.
the Great
Right, the Great
Society,
Society.
as opposed to the New
But
Deal.
I think it's
Did you
both-
ever get the New Deal and the Great Society confused?
No, I think it's both of those things. That
Okay.
in my mind, I truthfully, I don't think I sat down long enough to study it and
Yeah.
look at all of the
Well, you
implications
were in
of it.
musical theater.
Right, I
right?
was. That's true.
Yeah. You were not a poli-sci major.
Actually, I was a poli-sci minor.
Oh.
Theater major, poli-sci
Scratch
minor,
that.
working on
Oops.
Capitol Hill. I should have known better. But anyway, my point is there are some strongholds in my brain that I do need to look at and evaluate. And after our podcast, we did have an offline conversation where I was further educated, and I do want to apologize for being so hard on the New Deal. And I will more carefully think about my position.
And if you, I told Christian this, but I just watched Ken Burns' documentary on the Dust Bowl, which is on Netflix right now. You can watch it for free if you have a Netflix subscription. It's like, 4 hours long. Fascinating stuff.
What's the name of it?
The Dust Bowl.
Okay.
The Dust Bowl.
The
Do you know
Dust
what it's
Bowl.
about?
It's a football game, right?
1930s depression?
The Dust Bowl. No, it's not a football game.
Sometimes you say things and it takes us a second to catch them.
And it has a very
was
interesting
good.
view, or gives you very interesting view of what life was like during the Depression and what the New Deal did, where it worked, where it didn't work. So I found it highly educational, and I would highly recommend it. Okay, last thing, because then we got to wrap up. What a great episode. This is John Golden. What a great episode. Christian's reaction to modern American religious history was amazing. Love to hear the so what from you guys, given that history.
I agree with
So
you.
what?
So
Great
what?
question.
So what?
What does all that matter?
That's usually my
How
question.
Does it affect
How
my
does
life
it affect me? Why should I
today?
care about this?
Because it makes me, I just wonder, even reading some of the responses, why are we so uptight about whether or not America is Christian or not? Why?
Why does it rile us up?
I mean, how does it affect my ability to live out my faith on a day-to-day basis?
Here's one idea.
Okay.
I'm not saying this is right, but
You're just spitballing.
I'm just spitballing. I think many of us love America. It's our home, it's our country, it's our heritage, and it's almost like
Do you love America,
I do.
Scott?
I love America.
Because that seemed like something that President Obama might say, trying to be kind of in the
No, I'm just.
Many of us do love America.
Here's what I'm thinking. Like a lot of
Why
people.
are y'all
do
slipping
him.
into Southern? I do not
that
understand
was my
at
attempt
all.
at President Obama. So that was really
Both
bad.
of you went into your Southern for whatever reason.
I think it's similar to the idea that we all want our children to be followers of Christ because
Yeah.
it's such a core part of our identity. Those that we dearly love, we want to have that be true of them as well. And I think there's a sense of, I want my country to be Christian because I really love my country and I want it to be good in God's eyes. And my identity is so wrapped up in being an American and it's so wrapped up in being a Christian that I don't know how to separate
Right.
those two things. So I'd feel a lot better about myself and about everything else if my country history and heritage is the same as mine. The other thing it does for us is it gives us a massive ammunition against our cultural and political critics to say, I'm in line with what America's always been and you're not. And I
Right.
think that's just,
Right.
it's
So we can draw a line of what America was supposed to be.
Right.
So we can declare certain ideas out of bounds.
right.
Well, and
That makes sense.
is it possible that there is a fear that this country is changing.
It is.
Radically. And it's not at all what it used to look like. And there's fear of that. There's fear that we're going to become more like Europe, where there's a much bigger Muslim population, and that's going to change things. And it's stuff we don't know, we're afraid of, things we've been told aren't true.
But, here's the thing. When you talk to a friend who's an African American and you start waxing eloquent about how great the 1950s were, most African Americans are going, no, it wasn't that great for our community. It may have been great for yours. So I think as Christians who are called to love our neighbors, what we need to do is, as we look at the past in our country, is we need to be discerning and say, you know what, there were things about the past in America which are really good that we need to hang on to. There are other things about the past in America that were really bad that we need to abandon. And the same thing is true in the future. There are things that are happening in this country right now which frankly are really good. And we need to celebrate those things. There are other developments which are not good, but you can't just paint with a broad brush and say everything coming is bad and everything in the past was good.
After watching Ken Burns I've been watching a lot of Ken Burns documentaries because I've been building small things at home. Not going to say any more about that.
Little chairs, perhaps?
Perhaps little chairs. After watching his documentary on the West and our expansion into the West, I think the worst possible way to share the love of God with a Native American is to say, this is Christian America, and we're here to help. Because we were terrible to Native Americans. Absolutely
Well, and I
ghastly.
still think the way we treat Native Americans is also terrible.
Casinos?
Just sticking them in these tiny little reservations and saying, this is your land. I don't know. It didn't work out well for them, how we treated them.
This could get me in some hot water.
That's your understatement of the year, Christian. Uh-oh, Sky.
No, but I think
Water.
as followers of Christ, our first allegiance is not to the Constitution of the United States. This is the statement where I guarantee I'll never run for public office, right? Our first loyalty is not to the Constitution of the United States, it's to Jesus Christ. And as we think about our country and what we want to see happen here, rather than just adopting a party line or adopting some heritage or whatever, we need to be thinking about what is the gospel and what does Jesus call us to stand for today in our very pluralistic culture, and how do we love our neighbors, rather than just going, all right, whatever they did in 1776, that's how we need to continue to do it because we're Americans first.
Right. Someone else wrote in and said, well, don't you think adding God to the money in the 1950s was just returning to what the founding fathers had wanted in the first place, which is hard to argue for when they very deliberately didn't mention God in the Constitution.
Right.
If you could see where God was removed from things and then added back in the 50s, you can build that argument, but that doesn't appear to be the case.
Well, and I truthfully do not believe that, our salvation or the second coming or any of those things is going to be accomplished in us having a politically Christian nation. The answers for us are not here in our government. They're not. They're in
It is so true.
the Bible and our relationship with Jesus.
I got to wrap it up. Hey, do you care-a if you live in America, if it's Christian or not? Tell me, what have you got to complain about? You can still live your faith, and you can live it all over the place, from Florida to the outer space.
American Isles.
No, I had to rhyme with ace.
Right.
You can put your faith right on your face, even if it's not official. We won't be sending any missiles to annihilate the heathens anymore, because we decided that's not what government is for. And if this song is boring and you start to snore, I apologize, but we don't get paid anything to do this. All right, you get what you pay for.
Bye, everybody.
See you next time.
Yeah.